everybody. I hope you're enjoying Friend and Fox's Day. I want to talk today about web accessibility and ways in which you can get started with it. Just before we get started, my name's Josefine. My pronouns are she, her, and I originally come from a communications background. I got to web development actually a couple of years ago through a coding bootcamp. And on my first job, we had to implement accessibility. That's kind of how I got in touch with the topic. I was surprised how many also experienced web developers were not super familiar with it. So that's why today I want to give a brief introduction of what that means and how you can get started with it. So what is web accessibility and why is it important? Web accessibility basically means that websites, tools, and technologies are designed and implemented in a way that people with disability can use them to participate equally on the web. It's also a basic human right defined by the United Nations. So if you're still wondering if that's something that's relevant maybe for your website or your project, I have a really big number for you. So there was a report by the World Health Organization on Disability, and they have found that over 15% of the population worldwide experiences some form of disability. And that's over 1 billion people. Of course, global data is really hard to measure, and the experience of disability is of course really difficult to put into numbers, but even if it's just a ballpark, it's a really powerful one. And also, as a society, we're generally growing older, so this number tends to get larger in the future as well. So even if you are looking at this kind of from a business perspective, I hope that the sheer amount of people that are affected by this and their massive spending power convinces you that this is also relevant for you and basically for everyone. And if this is not enough, I have here a table that shows many of the potential user groups. So there are different kinds of disabilities like physical, auditory, cognitive, neurological, speech, or visual disabilities. But you can also see here people without disabilities. So for example, people using mobile phones. So you're on a small screen and maybe you have a different input type, like maybe you're trying to use a smart TV and put in through the remote control something that you're looking for. We already talked about older people. There are also temporary disabilities like a broken arm, or maybe you have lost your glasses, or situational limitations such as bright sunlight, or maybe you're in an environment where you can't turn up the volume, or you have a slow internet connection. And all of these are cases in which web accessibility is very beneficial. So if I have convinced you now, what does web accessibility look like in practice? It could mean providing enough color contrast, providing transcripts or captions, alternative text, be open for different input methods like not only mouse but also the keyboard or assistive technology. It could mean providing compatibility with different kinds of platforms, or things like explaining unfamiliar terms and not necessarily assuming that everybody has the same base knowledge. Speaking of unfamiliar terms, in web accessibility, there are a couple of terms that get thrown around quite a lot, and I just wanted to get them out of the way. The most common one, I guess, is the A11Y. That means accessibility, and the 11 stands for the 11 letters between the A and the Y. Then we have the WCAG, so those are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. That's a shared international standard with different levels of accessibility. We have the level A, AA, and AAA, and these are basically the different kinds of inclusivity and strictness, if you will, when it comes to accessibility. And A is the least strict one, and AAA is the strictest one. And these different levels are all created by the Web Accessibility Initiative, WAI, and they provide background information, documentation, further links on what you can do to make it more accessible. Now, where can you start? Just a disclaimer, I will mention a couple of tools here. However, I have no affiliation with them. And there are many other great tools. So if you have some favorites, I'd be delighted to learn about them. Feel free to share them in the chat. I'm always very curious. And these are just some personal preferences, really. Let's have a look. So the first topic I want to talk to you about is semantic HTML. Here we're basically laying the foundation of all things web accessibility. So it basically means using the HTML elements for their given purpose. So each element has a specific meaning, right? Like the H1 is the most important headline of the page. We're using an A tag for a link, a UL for an unordered list, and there are many more. I'm continuously being surprised of how many. And if we use them in the way that they are intended, we give the page structure rather than just presenting everything. And of course, you could use CSS to style things and JavaScript to make things function the way that you want to, but there are many good reasons to use semantic HTML. The first one being, well, the context that you provide, for example, for screen readers. So some of these elements come with basic default styles and inherent functionality, like built-in keyboard accessibility, for example. So we have the button element, for example, which has a standard look that you, of course, can override if you wanted to. But it's clickable, and it already has built in the fact that you can click it, that you can tap to it, that it's interactive when you're using the keyboard. We also have, for example, different kinds of cursor styles when an element is disabled, and all these things come out of the box, right? Also, it helps structure the code, it makes it easier to maintain and to read, and it helps with SEO and performance. So, what can you do? You can return to your code with semantics in mind. You can, for example, check if there's maybe a more precise element that you can use for your intended purpose. So, for example, check the difference between an article and an aside. You can check for alt attributes and make sure you include alternative text for important visuals. Select the correct input type, also very helpful, especially, for example, when you're on mobile. Add labels, all these kinds of things. Let me switch over to the browser and we can have a look at what that could look like. So I have, for example, this small tool. It's for Chrome, the web developer tool. And I can select here my CSS tab and turn off all styles. And it's not going to be pretty, but you're going to see what kind of layout you have on your page. To see, for example, so this is one of the most important headlines. You see here we have a list with all our links, and these things are really important to check when you want to see if you have used semantic HTML. What does your site look like to a screen reader, for example? I'm going to turn the styles back on, and what you can of course also always check is in the developer tools, inspect the elements and check, for example, okay, so this is an H1, that makes a lot of sense, or is there a navigation element, for example, used in the right place? Are we including for the images alternative text, for example, and all of these things we can check here in the DevTools manually as well. Now, another important topic is color contrast. Color and contrast are vital to accessibility. It's one of the most important things, or one of the things that most often goes wrong. And basically we're having a look at the perceived luminance or brightness from the foreground and the background. So we want to make sure our content is perceivable, and that's the contrast between the text and the background and the foreground. We want it to be at least 4.5 to 1 to match level AA standard. And so there are also tools that you can use to check. For example, this color contrast checker I can use to select the background color. And here we already have the foreground color. And you see I have a contrast of 15.3. So this means we have enough contrast between the background and the foreground, which is quite good. There are also some tools that give a bit more of a general overview to simulate the experience of disability. And this can be quite nice to figure out how different user groups experience your website. For example, you can choose the Web Disability Simulator. And here I could go, for example, for the total color blindness. And I can see what the site looks like with color blindness. I can find out more, or I can go for red-green color, yellow-blue color blindness, for example. And this way I can play around with it a bit and see what different people might see on my page. Even though this is not 100% accurate, of course, it gives a general idea and opens up the horizon a little bit. And the last topic I want to talk about is keyboard accessibility. So many people with motor disability, for example, rely on the keyboard, and also assistive technology depends highly on whether you can use a page with a keyboard. Blind users, for example, also use the keyboard for navigation. So of course it's also very important for general user experience, like being able to tab through everything. And there are a couple of things that you can do. So you want to make sure that all the elements are reachable with the keyboard, and that you can not only tab there, but also tab away so you don't trap your user. You want to make sure the tab order, so the logical flow through the page, actually makes sense. And also to include all the functionality that you have with a mouse, also via keyboard. And so a very common issue is hover. For example, you have some functionality with the hover state that you then don't have with a keyboard, and you want to make sure everything is accessible that way. Semantic HTML will help you here. It's also important to have enough color contrast for the focus state, so you see at every point where you are with your keyboard. You can, as a challenge, try to navigate your page with a keyboard and see what it's like if you can get all the places that you want to go. And there are also some tools. I have here it's called Tab Ally. I can run that on my page, and you will visualize the tab order in which I would go through all the interactive elements on my page. And here we go. So you see we're going from left to right and from top to bottom, which is really good. It looks quite logical. And so this is how you can visualize what that would be like, in addition to manually testing, of course. That was already all from my side. Thank you so much for coming, for listening to my talk. I hope it was helpful to you. And please keep in mind that in the case of web accessibility, 10% done is better than nothing. It's an ongoing process, and every small step counts. If you have any questions about web accessibility or anything else that I talked about, feel free to reach out, and I would love to connect. Thank you so much.